Thanks for joining this podcast. You've selected Jason's Amazing Race Recap 37, where I'll discuss episode number 2 of The Amazing Race, season 37. There's lots to talk about today, so let's get started. I'm your host, Jason Mogul. When we last saw The Amazing Race in episode 1, the racers were split into 2 routes, with 7 teams on each one. Jackie and Lauren were eliminated on the sing route, and Mark and Larry were eliminated on the dance route. When episode 1 ended, I was curious as to how and in what order the racers would leave the pit stop after leg 1, which ended with the fork in the road. It didn't take long to see that the fork in the road ended at the pit stop, and the racers essentially went back to normal at the pit stop. One thing I didn't mention in my previous podcast on episode 1 was that I didn't hear Phil mention anything about non-elimination legs this season, so I assume there will be at least one this season. If true, this would be different than the last 2 seasons when there were no non-elimination legs. I'll keep my eyes open for that. And as a follow-up, I noticed a strange and potential inconsistency regarding Jackie. In China, she claimed to have a fear of stairs because of a previous fall and needed help going down the steps to the bronze Buddha. But when I rewatched the beginning of episode 1, at the starting line when the racers descended a set of stairs to get to their first clue, you can see her running down them unaided and seemingly without fear. Did we miss something there? On to episode 2. The racers left for leg 2 in the same order they arrived at the pit stop, regardless of which route they took at the fork in the road. 12 teams remain, and Carson and Jack left first to find out they were headed to Osaka, Japan. The clue told them to go to a specific travel agency to get airline tickets, so it didn't seem like they had much choice on where to buy tickets. But there were some choices to make regarding which flights to take. There was a flight that arrived at 6:05 a.m., but that involved a layover, a potential risky option. If the first leg were delayed for some reason, then racers might miss the connecting flight and fall far behind. The next flight was a direct flight, but arrived 30 minutes later, perhaps a much safer option. And then the next flight after that was something like an hour and 20 minutes later than the second flight, a significant gap. Melinda and Erica were the last to leave for the travel agency, having arrived in 12th place at the pit stop on the previous leg. It seems there was some room for interpretation regarding the name and location of the travel agency. The taxi drivers for Nick and Mike, and Bernie and Kerrigan, were unsure of the location and took them to the wrong building, and they had to find their way to the right building, costing them time. Once at the travel agency, some teams selected the layover flight because of its earlier arrival, but others decided to take the second flight to reduce risk. These 2 flights filled up fast, and 4 teams had to book seats on the last flight. Once teams arrived at the airport, however, Melinda and Erica, and Jeff, stuck on that 3rd flight, were successful at moving from the 3rd flight to the 2nd flight by getting on standby through their own initiative. This was some smart play in my opinion. However, Scott and Lori and Bernie and Kerrigan initially tried but kind of gave up trying to get better flights. In the end, 3 teams were on the earliest flight, 7 teams made it to the 2nd flight, and 2 teams, Bernie and Kerrigan and Scott and Lori, were on that last flight. There was a lot of time spent showing the ticket purchasing and layover versus direct flight strategic thinking process. And as for me, I would have selected the direct flight. Even though it costs 30 minutes, we have seen several times in the past on The Amazing Race where teams risked faster flights with layovers only for it to backfire. While in the terminal waiting for their flight, Bernie and Kerrigan had a disagreement that boiled over into quite an emotional discussion. Just moments earlier in the taxi, Bernie and Kerrigan talked about how they fight with each other all the time, like a married couple, but eventually work it out in the end. There's some foreshadowing for you. Bernie was upset because she felt Kerrigan was not taking her input seriously. Whenever she had an idea, Kerrigan would dismiss it, try her idea first, but eventually they would go back to Bernie's idea. Tears flowed and arms waved as this went on. All the while, Scott was sitting nearby. He couldn't help but listen in, entertained by all the drama, like he was listening to a podcast. On my last podcast episode, I discussed how I felt the early physical challenges of stairs, hills, tower climbing, and dragon dancing all made the racers tired and fatigued on that first leg. It's an observation of mine, having watched so much past Amazing Race seasons. I believe that fatigue and jet lag caught up with Bernie and Kerrigan, causing the drama we saw. Tired racers after just one leg. Just like Bernie mentioned in the taxi, they patched things up and moved on. When they arrived in Japan, racers were instructed to find their next clue at the Sututenteiko Tower. Oh boy, did I chop that one up. It looked kind of like a mini Eiffel Tower and was built in 1956 as part of a nearby park. It reminded me of the mini Eiffel Tower at Kings Island in Cincinnati. When opened, the clue revealed itself to be route info to the next clue at Namba Hatch, which is a music venue. And the first team to arrive there was Ernest and Bridget, who seemed to come out of nowhere to be in first place. We saw very little of them in the first episode, so this is their time to shine. There, they face the intersection roadblock. The intersection is where one person from two separate teams split from their original team and work together on a task. Teams pair up as they arrive at the intersection, or they can wait for a specific team behind them if they choose. The choice is either to go as soon as the next team arrives, or wait. Waiting is usually bad, for a team they feel they can perform better with. Once completed, the original teams form back up again and continue to race. Why would they have this arrangement on The Amazing Race? What is so special about the intersection? There are several reasons in my opinion. One is that two people who are not familiar with each other now have to work together, and this may cause drama or comedy. A second reason may be it helps to jumble up the race order because of the uncertainty of how long the task will take with a new partner. And the third is for teams to get to know one another better. But the main reason, in my opinion, is that the intersection is an alliance buster. I don't like alliances, and I don't think the producers do either. I believe the race was never meant to be groups of teams working together, but rather it was to be all teams in competition with each other. By splitting teams up, it makes it harder for teams to form and maintain alliances. How do you feel about that? Is there some other reason the intersection is part of the race? The second team to arrive was Brett and Mark. Ernest was happy about that, but it appeared to me that Brett and Mark and the third team to arrive, Jack and Carson, wanted to pair up together. But some previous unseen agreement on how teams would pair up meant that Mark and Ernest would be the first intersection team. The task was to join a taiko drum band and learn and play a drum routine. It was a complicated arrangement, and I thought it was no easy task. Phil explained that musicians had been playing those drums for 12,000 years. Wow, I thought those drums didn't look 12,000 years old. They look brand new. Anyway, other teams arrived and paired up. But Han and Holden, they were delayed because they let their taxi go while they were getting their clue and had to find another one. A potential costly mistake. The real story here is that Ernest and Bridget were the first team to arrive, but were the last team to leave. Ernest just could not perform the task without mistakes. Mark had some musical training, and he did his best to support Ernest. He was very patient, but he was also frustrated. In the end, it took them 17 tries to get it right. Most teams took from 3 to 8 attempts to complete, but Scott and Bernie were successful on their first attempt. Quite impressive. The first team to complete the drum task was Jonathan and Jack, which meant that Jonathan and Anna and Jack and Carson left that task first to find their next clue at a bridge. Once there, the clue revealed a detour: making rice balls, mochi, or dressing for sumo wrestling, mawashi. Which one would you pick? Personally, I would have picked sumo wrestling, mainly because I think food prep tasks are harder and take longer than they seem on paper. But sumo wrestling is also pretty cool. 3 teams selected mochi, and began pounding the rice into a dough. Courtney and Jasmine completed it first without too much difficulty. Jeff and Jeff had to redo theirs because they made them in various sizes, and they were supposed to be all the same size. Melinda and Erica, they were close behind. I have to say, the sumo wrestling task was the most entertaining task I've seen in a while. Teams had to wrap each other in the traditional waistcloth and then push the sumo wrestler out of the sumo ring. It involved attention to detail from both team members to get the cloth just right. It took most teams several attempts, and we saw some intimate handling of the human body by both teammates, which led to some funny moments. The sumo wrestler was himself entertaining, with patience as he dealt with amateurs. He may not have intended to, but he did steal the scene in his quiet way. And what about the blurred out portions of some of the wrestlers' bodies? Something must have been hanging out of their cloths in their groin area to force the editors to blur it out. What could that be? In the end, Jonathan and Anna finished first and headed to a pagoda to the pit stop, where they did indeed come in first and won points towards a trip to Kilimanjaro, Tanzania. They went from first to eighth, then clawed their way back to first again after 2 legs. But the big surprise to me was Scott and Lori, who came in second. I loved the expression on Lori's face when she learned she had to touch and push the mostly naked and very large body of the wrestler out of the circle. I laughed out loud at that. Strong performances at the drums and at the sumo wrestling site allowed them to leapfrog several teams and overcome their late flight. Despite having so much trouble at the drums and looking like it was over for them, Brett and Mark finished 9th out of 12, making up time at the sumo wrestling. Nick and Mike struggled at this task more than I expected, and they were getting frustrated. But it was Ernest and Bridget who came in last. Having finished the drums last and were not able to make up time at sumo wrestling, all other teams passed them and they were eliminated. That was a huge turnaround for them because they arrived first at the intersection. So, after 2 legs this season, we've seen several lead changes and some surprising performances, both good and bad, by the teams. The polite phase is ending as the stress of the race on their bodies and minds allows us to see some cracks start to form in their outer shell. Will we see more of this in the future? Do you have any changes on who you think will win? There's still a lot of racing left, so I guess we're just going to have to keep watching. Phil promises that more is in store for the teams and for us in the future. I enjoyed this episode, especially the sumo wrestling detour. I was intrigued and kind of grossed out at the same time, yet unable to look away. I was thoroughly entertained. After 36 seasons, The Amazing Race is able to return to a country they have previously visited and still find new locations and new ways to entertain. Osaka, Japan did not disappoint. That's all for the second episode of Season 37 of The Amazing Race. As always, thanks for joining, and tune in next time for Episode 3 of Jason's Amazing Race Recap 37, where we will find out where the teams are off to next. See you then.